There is something so wonderfully satisfying about stitching an applique design. But before we get to that good point, there is some preparation involved. I'm Kathy Wiley, and in this tutorial we will talk about how to prepare your fabrics for applique. The steps will vary depending on your applique method, so we will look at 3 alternatives: needle turn, Appliquick, and Fusible applique. This tutorial was developed for the Birth Flowers Block of the Month patterns, but the procedures could be used for any applique design. Let's begin by talking about the background fabric. I like to trace the applique design onto the background fabric first. Here's how. Start with a piece of fabric slightly larger than the unfinished block size. The Birth Flowers blocks finish at 16 inches, which would be 16.5 inches with seam allowance. So I would suggest cutting an 18-inch square of background fabric. Fold the background fabric in half, vertically and horizontally, and press to mark the centers. The pattern drawings have dashed lines to indicate the vertical and horizontal centers of the block. Lay the background fabric over the pattern drawing, matching the folds with the horizontal and vertical center lines, and pin the layers together. I like to use a light box to make it easier to see through the background fabric, but you could also use a bright window or put a light under a glass top table. Trace the applique design onto the background fabric using a removable fabric marker. I have 3 favorite fabric markers I like to use. The fine line makes a fine blue line that is removed by immersing the fabric in water. Spritzing the lines with a water bottle may not remove them entirely. Soaking is best. Clover's white marker makes a bright white line that can be removed with a hot iron or with water. Note that with this marker, it takes a few seconds for the lines to appear. The Bowen mechanical pencil has ceramic inserts that wash out or rub out over time. The inserts are available in white, pink, yellow, green, and gray. Bowen also makes a water eraser paintbrush, which is very handy for removing a line if you make a mistake. Choose the fabric marker that will work best with your fabric and trace the entire applique design onto the background. To prepare for needle turn applique, I begin by making freezer paper templates. If you made templates for auditioning your fabrics, as I described in the Choosing Fabrics tutorial, you can reuse them for preparing your fabrics. Make a template for each applique shape by tracing it from the pattern drawing onto the dull side of freezer paper and cutting it out. If you also record the patch number onto the freezer paper, the templates can be used to identify the patches after they have been prepared. Freezer paper templates can be reused, so only one template needs to be made for each shape. Iron the freezer paper template shiny side down onto the right side of the fabric. Trace around the outside edges of the freezer paper using a removable marker. I like to use a sandpaper board underneath the fabric. It makes the fabric easier to mark and keeps it from slipping. Remove the freezer paper, then cut out the applique shape, leaving a seam allowance. How much seam allowance? Well, for me, it is somewhere less than 1/4 inch, but more than 1/8 of an inch. So what's that? 3/16 of an inch? I guess this is where the expression scant 1/4 inch came from. You will also need to clip the seam allowance at inside points and along inside curves. If you haven't done a lot of needle turn applique, you might also like to finger crease the seam allowance along the marked line. This makes it so much easier to turn under the seam allowance with your needle, hence the name needle turn, because the fabric has already been creased there. The prepared shapes are now ready to be needle turn appliqued. They can be stored in small zipper bags along with their freezer paper templates for identification. To prepare for Apliquick, the templates will be made from interfacing rather than freezer paper. Trace each shape onto Apliquick lightweight fusible interfacing or wash-away applique sheets. If you trace on the fusible side, which the Apliquick pencils were designed to do, the shapes will not reverse when they are ironed onto the back side of the fabric. These templates cannot be reused, so you will need to make one for every shape in the design. Cut out the interfacing on the marked lines. Position the interfacing shape on the back side of the applique fabric, making sure there is at least 1/4 inch from the outside edges and 1/2 inch between shapes, and press. I use a low cotton setting with no steam and press for 2 to 3 seconds at a time until the interfacing is firmly bonded to the fabric. Cut out the shape, leaving a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once again, you will need to clip the seam allowance along inside curves and at inside points. Apply water-soluble glue to the seam allowance. I like the Bowen glue pen. It has a small applicator tip, so I can place the glue precisely. It goes on pink so I can see it, dries clear so I know when it has lost its stickiness, and it is refillable so I can keep adding more glue to the pen with refill cartridges. Use Appliquick rods to quickly and precisely turn under the seam allowance before sewing. The prepared shapes are now ready to be sewn by hand or by machine. The interfacing remains inside the applique, so I do not recommend identifying the patches by writing on the interfacing, just in case the writing might show through the fabric. I identify my Appliquick prepared patches in one of 2 ways, either with a freezer paper template lightly fused onto the patch with an iron, or by tacking my pattern onto a piece of cardboard or foam core. Then each prepared shape can be pinned in place on the pattern drawing. To prepare for fusible applique, the templates will be made from fusible web. This is not a turned edge method, so the applique edges will be raw unless you cover them with some type of stitching. Trace each shape onto the paper side of fusible web. These templates cannot be reused, so you will need to make one for every shape in the design. With this applique method, the shapes will reverse when they are ironed onto the back side of the fabric. The birth flower patterns are largely symmetrical, so when you trace shape 17.1, for example, it will reverse to become 17.1R. Similarly, when you trace 17.1R, it will reverse to become 17.1. The exception will always be the large birth flower in the center of the block. I think the easiest way to reverse the pattern is to turn over the pattern drawing and trace from the back. Once again, a light box can help to make the lines more visible for tracing. You can identify the shapes by writing the patch number on the paper side of a fusible web. In the birth flowers block of the buck patterns, the shapes are all connected, so you may also want to identify any edges of a shape that will be covered by another shape in order to add a bit of an underlap allowance. Let's look at this snowdrop, flower 17 in the January block. Without any underlap allowance, the shapes need to line up perfectly or there will be unsightly gaps. Add the allowance as you are tracing, so you will know to cut out the shape with the underlapping edges. Rough cut each shape from the fusible web. Position the shape paper side up on the back side of the fabric and press in place. Cut the shape from the fabric following the marked lines on the fusible web. If you use light Steam-A-Seam 2 fusible web, the fabric will be slightly sticky when you remove the paper liner. This is very helpful for holding the shapes in place on the background fabric until you are ready to fuse them in place permanently. Doesn't the snowdrop look better with that extra little allowance to tuck under? Whichever method you choose, you will be well prepared to applique your birth flower block. You can even use different applique methods within the same block, as I did. Don't forget to share your progress with our Birth Flowers Block of the Month Facebook group or on Instagram with #BirthFlowerBlock. And check back to the website at kathykyley.com/birthflowers for more tips and tutorials.